History as it happens, January 21st, 2021. Trumpism after Trump.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft.
Donald Trump is out of the White House. Trumpism is still with us. How long it remains a force in American politics may depend on whether the narrative of a stolen election endures. Nothing lasts like a story, even a lost cause. As we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
You can take third world countries. Just take a look. Take third world countries. Their elections are more honest than what we've been going through in this country. It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. Even when you look at last night, they're all running around like chickens with their heads cut off with boxes, and nobody knows what the hell is going on. There's never been anything like that.
Hello, everyone. What a month. A riot at the Capitol, impeachment, inauguration, and coming soon, a Senate trial. All while thousands of Americans die every day in the coronavirus pandemic. It was like living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the transfer of power. Well, as I speak into this microphone, America does have a new president.
Recent weeks and months have taught us a painful lesson. There is truth and there are lies. Lies told for power and for profit.
Joe Biden wants to put the Trump presidency in the past, but it seems certain we'll have to keep talking and thinking about Donald Trump, at least in the short term. As mentioned, his Senate trial is coming up. Love him or loathe him, Trump was a consequential leader. The impact of what is already called Trumpism will be felt for some time. He dominated the news day after day for 5 years, starting with this.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people.
Trump Tower, June 2015. And that's a good opening to this episode's subject. Trumpism, redefining the limits on what we expect or accept from the mouths of leaders.
And then those illegals get out and vote because they vote anyway. Don't kid yourself. Those numbers in California and numerous other states, they're rigged.
Let's look at this with a broader lens. How do you define Trumpism? Is it a list of policies, an approach to governing, or is it an attitude or worldview? Say, we the people versus those out of touch and condescending experts and elitists who've forgotten about us. Historian David Blight, writing in the New York Times, says Trumpism is a narrative upon which Trump's future political fortunes may rise again. In assessing the political lifespan and potency of the narrative of a stolen election, an election Trump says he won but was stolen by radical left Democrats and the fake news media, Blight wants us to think about the lost cause. That was the prevailing myth of the post-Civil War United States. It had enormous multi-generational effects on our society, and Blight's point is, if the myth of a stolen election endures, think about how that would affect our country and our politics today. Let's start our conversation with Edward Ayers, one of the finest Civil War scholars in our country today. Edward Ayers is President Emeritus of the University of Richmond. Ed, let's briefly begin with what is the lost cause? The survivors of the Confederacy erasing the cause of secession, which was slavery, and inventing this lost cause, capital L, capital C. But its origins date to the start of the Confederacy, not its end, right?
They had a complete narrative from the beginning about who they were and what they were doing. In many ways, the Confederacy, which did not expect to lose until deep into the war, in some ways you can see them preparing the way for the lost cause from the beginning when they talked about how much larger and more powerful the United States was than the Confederate States of America. They knew that the world was moving away from slavery, and the South, as the largest and most powerful slave society in the modern world, was sort of on its own out there. And they were desperately trying to establish a nation state with all the paraphernalia and flags and uniforms and generals and presidents that, in the eyes, especially of Europe, would qualify them as a nation state. So from the beginning, they portrayed themselves as, and they would compare themselves to similar efforts in Poland or other parts of Europe where freedom-seeking people were trying to overthrow those who would dominate them.
And you say, after the war, Robert E. Lee planted more seeds of this evolving myth?
You see a pivot. Robert E. Lee's address to his troops at Appomattox. And what he says is that we lost because of numbers and men. We were just simply too much stuff and too many men thrown at us. It doesn't mean we were wrong. It doesn't mean we were weak. It doesn't mean that we failed in any way. They simply had more. And so from that moment on, and you'll recognize certain echoes of the present, refusing to concede that they had been wrong. They had simply been defeated.
So not wrong, just defeated. That's interesting. It took some time, right, for the lost cause myth to fully permeate the culture. Donald Trump and his most ardent followers have already convinced millions of people, if we are to believe the polls, that he won the election.
Yeah, well, I'd say two things. One, on the current day, President Trump had been laying the groundwork for this since his own election, in which he declared even though he had won, the election had been rigged. And his refusal to concede was the way to sort of cinch that argument that if I don't concede, that shows you how much my story is true. I would want to point out that the Cult of the Lost Cause, the book that gave it its name was published a year after Appomattox, and it was called The Lost Cause. And they began constructing the narrative right then. You're exactly right that it took a long time for all the paraphernalia to accrue. Mm-hmm. We've been having a long-running debate in Richmond about the Lee statue that went up in 1890, and pointing out that Lee, during his own life, said there should not be statues because they're just going to cause problems. He dies in 1870, however, and a movement to memorialize him begins immediately. So I would point out that, first of all, the scale of the Confederacy and of Trumpism are of entirely different orders of magnitude. But I would say that, as my friend David Blight pointed out in his recent article, the parallels are certainly there. And in the same way that the order of magnitude is greater, so did what had to be explained away. So much greater in the Confederacy. How do you explain away over 2 centuries of slavery?
Is it safe to say that Trumpism won't go away right away?
No, I think that's a fair statement, and nothing endures like a story. If you think about the Civil War today, the last poll I saw said that 40% of the people who were questioned think that the Civil War was about states' rights. Well, no historian has said that for generations, and yet it endures. The other thing that historians have said that I found to be the most pervasive story about the Civil War is that it was a conflict between the industrial North and the agrarian South. Now, people like that because it sounds blameless, but the fact is that well over 90% of Northerners were farmers in the Civil War, and the South's not agrarian, it's forced labor on plantations, which is a big difference.
That's right.
You'll find that people will tell that story. So I bring that up just to show you that a story can resist or absorb enormous amounts of contrary evidence. It doesn't really matter what experts say. It doesn't really matter what evidence arrayed says. People need a story to make quick sense of the world in which we live. So the fact that Trump has been able to craft and promulgate and promote and sustain with what he and his followers believe is a mounting body of evidence, I think means that narrative will be with us for a while.
And if the narrative of Trumpism is going to endure, it won't necessarily need him anymore at some point, correct? Say if in 4 years a Republican member of the Senate wants to run for president on the Trumpist idea of taking back the country from a stolen election. Your thoughts?
Well, Robert E. Lee didn't have a statue until 20 years after his death. He was more powerful as a symbol in some ways than he would have been as a man, because he would have, like all of us, our lives would have changed. He would have said things. And if you think about it, too, the Confederacy itself never had to do anything an actual nation does for the next 150 years. It had to live on as a memory of a glorious unanimity among white Southerners. But it never had to tax you. It never had to, draft you again or anything. And so in some ways, it's more powerful if you don't have to have the friction of actual reality. If you can just imagine what Trump would have done, in some ways, it's more powerful than seeing what he actually would do.
And in its brief history, it was pretty bad at governing anyway, the Confederate States of America.
Yes, it was.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation with historian Edward Ayers of the University of Richmond. We are trying to look at this subject historically. Donald Trump is a remarkable figure. He never held public office. He took over one of the country's two major political parties, and through his charismatic personality convinced many Americans to believe everything he said, including his claim that he won the election. It was stolen from him.
And what's helpful in the story is that if it's based on fraud to begin with, of course we wouldn't have evidence of it. And so, and if it's based on a conspiracy, then it would be hidden. So that's one of the great strengths of the Trump story, is that the very lack of evidence is evidence.
And even Vice President Pence, so loyal to Trump during his entire term, has come in for criticism for not doing enough to uphold the story of the stolen election.
Yeah, there's not really a boundary to it if you believe that what this is about is Donald Trump is the embodiment of the will of the American majority. And I think it's also advantageous that he did not have to invent every element of this. With the QAnon conspiracy and all the other theories that weave into it, it brings the sources of energy in that he doesn't have to create himself.
So what can we learn about this now by looking at a subject that you've been closely involved with? What to do with symbols of the lost cause, Confederate monuments in Virginia and at the U.S. Capitol. These symbols remain potent. They continue to have powerful defenders some 160 years after the war. How do we tie these threads together?
It's interesting. When we first started talking about some of these things, a lot of people denied their potency. A lot of people on the left would say, why are we talking about these stupid statues when there are important issues to address, right? And I think that what we see now is that symbols matter. And I think as we saw, one of the most powerful images from the Capitol was the man carrying the Confederate flag, which tried to dismember the United States into the heart of the Capitol. And as some commentators said, we've just seen something happen in 2021 that never happened during the Civil War itself. So I think that people understand the story needs to be embedded in things that you can see, and statues and flags, it turns out, matter. It's not clear what the symbols are going to be of Donald Trump's legacy now.
And the immediate political future for Trump and Trumpism also unclear. Some powerful Republicans want to rid his influence before the 2022 midterm elections, but many elements of Trumpism have been part of Republican or conservative politics for a while now. It's not all about him, right?
I think that we've seen most of the elements of Trumpism before, and not that long ago, in George Wallace. Anti-elitism, anti-liberalism. They didn't use the word political correctness, but pointy-headed intellectuals and all those kind of things. Donald Trump tapped into deep and long-running currents in American history.
Let's listen to Wallace and Trump side by side. Wallace from his 1972 presidential campaign, Trump from 2017.
I did represent more of the average citizen in this country than did any other candidate, based on the fact that the man who works each day for a living and pays the taxes and holds the country together has been ignored, except on Election Day.
The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer.
Wallace is most remembered today for his pro-segregation stance, but he believed in those other things, too.
It'd be interesting to see how the visceral power of Trump is translated into policy. There's not really been much of that either. If you think about what's the enduring policy legacy of Donald Trump, it's not clear that there is one. These are great questions that you're asking.
Well, thank you. And by the way, are you a pointy-headed intellectual? But Donald Trump had a record, and many of his supporters wished he had just campaigned on his accomplishments more emphatically. He got derailed by culture wars and trying to convince people the pandemic would simply go away. And we should add, his failure to confront the pandemic was hard for him to escape. But his record, tax cuts, Supreme Court appointments, rewriting NAFTA.
But those were not really the things that were featured. And I do hear people who are sympathetic to Trump, saying, I just wish that he called Americans' attention to the things that he'd accomplished on those fronts. Even the border wall sort of fell away. And instead, the purpose of the election, became him, not the things for which he had fought. Does that mean it will be easier for the Republicans to diminish his role going forward because it is so personalized rather than programmatic? Or does it mean that this has somehow escaped their control and it is a force that now they won't be able to get back into the bottle?
Well, scholars such as yourself are always balancing larger historical forces and structures against contingency, the influence of individuals. In other words, how much of what our country has experienced depended on the actions of one Donald Trump.
Well, you're exactly right about the issues at hand. I think that the phrase that I put forward is called deep contingency, which is the way that a single event can change big structures. One day we wake up and then something happens and everything seems to pivot around it. The Capitol is one. And one thing about this, about deep contingency, you cannot tell in which ways it's going to radiate. The longest running structures and beliefs can shift with remarkable speed.
Well, after this month, I think we all need a short break. Ed Ayers, thank you. I want to mention our guest today won the prestigious Bancroft Prize in 2004 for In the Presence of Mine Enemies, Civil War in the Heart of America, and the Lincoln Prize in 2018 for The Thin Light of Freedom, Civil War and Emancipation in the Heart of America. And you can see Ed Ayers in action on the PBS program The Future of America's Past. Trumpism after Trump, our conversation today. It'll be fascinating to see whether it has a future in American politics. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll shift the conversation to the new president, Joe Biden, as he embarks on his first 100 days. Is it time for bold government action to confront the crisis, as FDR once inspired the nation to embrace?
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
Or are we still living in the age of Reagan, where big government initiatives are dead? That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.